Here we go. It's 1:30. Let's get started. My name is Barbara Sanders. I've been the education specialist here for about 27 years. That means I'm used to working with 8th graders and 5th graders and 4th graders, sometimes 11th graders, but very rarely adults unless they're teachers. But I'm happy to be here with you today talking about food. And because I get to pick my lecture topic. About 8 years ago, the college, Gettysburg College, had an exhibit about 19th century food, and that's kind of where this particular germ of a lecture started, the germ of this lecture, is I did a lecture for them. At that time, I created something called beef tea from a recipe, which was something they served in the hospitals. Don't get excited because it was pretty gross, but everybody, we tried it. We tried some of these things. I'm not allowed to give out food here, so I didn't make any beef tea for you, but I did bring some bits of hardtack that I made probably about that time. And when we do virtual programs with students, sometimes I will try it on camera. And I'll try to eat through this old hardtack. And 5th graders think that is hilarious, watching me. But I am interested, obviously, in history, but also very interested in food culture and food history. Do we have any foodies in the room? Okay, so I know a lot of you come to a lot of the lectures, and you're very into history. But I think that sometimes when we talk about Civil War food, we reference it, reenactors certainly understand food. They go out and try to live all the parts of the Civil War soldier life as they can. But sometimes we just talk about the weevils and the hardtack, and we kind of move on, right? So I would like to propose that food is a highly experiential element of history that can viscerally connect us with people and places of the past, therefore demonstrating our sameness with those in the past, and that is the universality of the human experience. And so beyond making this occasional batch of hardtack, I've rarely investigated the Civil War through the kitchen. So today we're going to do that by exploring hearth, hardtack, and hospital. So that is through home cooking, and preserving and what the soldiers would have come from, that type of food culture, in comparison to the typical Army rations in camp and the style of cooking on campaign. And then what I really am interested in is the prescriptive food, or how they used food as prescriptions in the hospitals. And we're going to focus on Camp Letterman, which was the large general hospital comprised of tents right here in Gettysburg after the battle and through November 21st to strengthen the sick and the wounded. So what did they serve? Why did they serve it? That's going to be the fourth part. But through my preparations for this lecture, those of you who are historians, amateur or professional, know that you go into these rabbit holes. And my rabbit hole was down the path of the United States Sanitary Commission materials. And so I have added a third H to this lecture, and that is health. So where the medical departments and the United States Sanitary Commission and on some level the Christian Commission fit into the food story of the Healthy Soldier own campaign. So not just for the wounded and how they prescribed food for the wounded, but what they were learning about the role that food took in the army. So there's kind of 4 sections to this. So I think Napoleon is credited for saying that an army runs on its stomach, right? So that's kind of also the impetus this way. So along the way, I hope we come to a more complete understanding of what food can tell us about these complex and distressing times, as well as perhaps a better appreciation of our modern understanding of food and its nutritional and healing properties. So here are just some of the source materials that I utilized over the course of this. A Taste for War which is a book by William C. Davis, Civil War historian. The War for the Common Soldier. I'll be quoting a letter from this by Dr. Carmichael. Hardtack and Coffee, of course, by John Billings. The Life of Billy Yank and The Life of Johnny Reb. These are all classic books, and they all have chapters on food and the ration. The Civil War Infantrymen in Camp, on the March, and in Battle by Greg Coco. I think we sell that one over here. Short, quick read, but good information in there. Campfires and Camp Cooking, or Culinary Hints for the Soldier, was published and distributed to the troops in 1862. Notes on Commissary Cooking and Equipment by Cody J. Harding. That is an online publication. Georgiana Woolsey, 3 Weeks at Gettysburg. She was one of the women who was here in Gettysburg, worked for the United States Sanitary Commission, and I love her. And she wrote a great piece. And I think the whole point of her piece was so that all of the people on the home front who were sending in food and materials for the soldiers, she could demonstrate how they were being used. But it's a really fascinating source of material. Other reports of the United States Sanitary Commission, the Handbook for the Military Surgeon by Tripler and Blackman was very interesting. And then there are a couple of other receipt or recipe collections that I'm going to reference later on, and all kinds of other materials. So I want you to think about, just for a second, your favorite meal as a child. Okay, think about what your favorite meal was, or a memorable meal, okay? Would anybody share one? Yes?
Grilled cheese sandwiches.
Oh, grilled cheese sandwiches, okay. All right, great, yeah. Mine, I have a ton, but I am the youngest of 16 children. I grew up on that farm right down in Littlestown, about 8 miles from here. We did our own butchering. When we were going to have chicken for dinner, my mom would go out, take a chicken, cut off the head, scald the chicken. We would have chicken for dinner, right? So I very, very much know where my food comes from. And I was also a big reader. Does anybody know where this illustration comes from? Thank you. You're my people. Yes. Yes. So I read Little House in the Little House series. I still read it. And so you know that first book, Little House in the Big Woods. Well, all the books, but they all go through all of the process of where they got their food and how they prepared their food and how Ma prepared the food. So these things, this history and food, is really, really connected for me. But I can tell you, so most of us have some personal connections to our food. Food was definitely informing my entryway into the study of history. But I can tell you with complete certainty that many young people today, I would dare to say most, have little understanding of where their food comes from. And I know that because we do a program at the John Slider Farm, which is at the base of Big Round Top. The John Slider family had a subsistence agriculture farm. Most of the buildings are still there, and we take kids, often fourth graders who study local history, out, and we put them through some of the chores. We have them build fences. The photograph on the right there is they're in front of the blacksmith shop. We have them hear the sounds of the blacksmith shop and things like that. And they're somewhat appalled and disgusted and completely surprised when we talk about the Sliders and how they grew and raised their food, how they got their dinner. And the point of the program is for kids to really take ownership after doing some of those chores and understanding that this was how the Sliders were going to feed themselves. They take ownership of that farm. And so at the end of the program then, when we do some role playing and they hear what happened to their farm over the course of the battle, and they have to make a quick decision, as the Slider family did, of whether they're going to stay at their farm, kind of try to protect it, or they're going to go and protect their lives. And then when they come back, how they found the farm, the damage claims, and all of this stuff. And a lot of student groups will say, I'm going to stay, and when we tell them that the Slider family left. and in fact then couldn't sell their farm and had to move west into Ohio and farm there. They're really, really surprised. So on this photograph, the Slider house, you'll notice on the left is a white building. Anybody know what that building is? That's their summer kitchen. So they would cook in the summer kitchen, especially in the summer to keep the heat out of the house, and also in case of fire. You see the doors down to the root cellar. I remember going down and storing all of our things down there. There is on the other side of the on the other side of the Sharpshooters Monument is the smokehouse, which every single student group thinks is the outhouse, and it is the smokehouse where they preserve their meats, and we have canned things and everything in there as well. So it's a really good program, but I'm telling you, most people don't know where their things came from. So to understand home cooking in the Civil War era, both North and South, this is a really good program that hopefully helps students gain a better understanding of that time period. There was true seasonal eating. You only bought what you could not grow. So we have in our pre-visit things, the seasons, and this is before tractors, and how important the horse was, and all the things you got from your milk cows, et cetera. And we talk a little bit about the preservation methods before there were refrigerators. So that included these things: drying, smoking, salting, pickling, fermenting, soaking in sugar syrup or alcohol. We talk about cooking over an open fire, although they did have cook stoves at that time. We're not sure if the Sliders did or not, but this is the patent of the James Cook stove occurred in Troy, New York in 1815. You can see this one, I think you can see at the very top, you can see this was manufactured in Gettysburg, up there on the top. So they may have had a model of this very stove. And the commercial canning of food began in the 1830s, although the can opener was not invented until 1858, so you'd be creative there. In 1860, there were about 5 million cans in the market. By 1870, there were about 30 million things in canned goods in the market. So the Sliders and other families, they obviously did their own canning, but there were groceries and stores in Gettysburg, so the wealthier or the townsfolk may have bought some things. Some of the canned products include, and you can see it evidenced on this photograph, condensed milk, tomatoes, oysters and sardines were big. Salmon, fruits, and vegetables. And we'll talk a little bit later about canned food being available at the sutlers for the Civil War soldiers to supplement their ration and their diet. But you had to be, usually that was the purview of the officers. The line soldier could not afford those luxuries. And in the South, as the Civil War begins, the blockade puts additional limitations on the foods that are available. In addition, most of the battles are taking place in the South, so the damage to the crops and all of that is going to affect their food sources. So what types of food and home cooking would the soldier be missing? Just like, my mom's 92. And she's probably in the last stages of life, and she still loves food, man. But she could stretch $1, right? So did anybody ever have spaghetti sandwiches? Yeah, we had spaghetti sandwiches, and we loved them. We had all these starches, so it's similar with the foundation of the daily meals at this time, pre-Civil War and during the Civil War, were meat and bread. And that was certainly my experience as a child as well. Fruits and vegetables depended on the availability and preservation, and cooking methods would deplete most of the nutritional value we now know. What did they know about nutrition? They knew about minerals. They knew about salt. They knew about those sorts of things. They did not know about vitamins. They weren't there yet. So it was really about filling you up. They might have had, again, going back to my personal experience, if we weren't feeling well, we got a piece of toast cut into 4 squares. I still can't cut it like my mom cut it, and tea. So I'm sure that the soldiers would be missing a lot of these comforting things that they knew from home. Did they know how to cook? No, they certainly didn't. And so there's going to be a big, often learning curve as they go through. So really quickly, this is a pig game that we play on the Slider farm. These are, we have different cards, and these are all different uses of parts of the pig. Hogs were something that in the South and the North, even if you lived in town, even here in town, you might have heard the story about Schimmelfinnig, the general hiding out in the pig pen right there on Baltimore Street. So why was pork the common staple? Well, because hogs they'll eat really anything. They'll eat your slop, right? They don't require a lot of space, and you can get a lot of things from them. So we demonstrate this with students by saying, okay, let's match up. So I'm wondering if you all can match these up. What was stuffed with potatoes and onions and baked in an oven? Okay, good. What was made into lard to cook and bake with? Used for making soap, lye soap. Also the fat. Looks like scrambled eggs, so made into a breakfast omelet. Oh, you're good. Children fought over this as there was only one and held it out to roast over a fire. Yeah, that's from Little House on the Prairie too, right? Tasty, chewy treats, today usually only for dogs. Ears and snout, right? An organ that converts food into sugars and energy. Pancreas, so we call sweetbreads, very good. Inflated to use as a ball for children's play. And thin but strong casing to hold ground sausage meat. Yeah, so now, are you hungry? I don't think so. So just to conclude our Hearth segment, home cooking in the mid-19th century is not fancy, it's not necessarily nutritious or tasty from our standards today, but it was filling, it was comforting, and it was affordable. And it is missed by thousands of soldiers who voluntarily went off to a war they thought would last maybe 3 months. They wrote home about the crops and the food, and their mothers and wives and sweethearts knew that thoughts of food meant thoughts of home, as evidenced by this letter, which was in Dr. Carmichael's book. Dear husband, you wrote in your letter that you wished you was at home to get some apples to eat. I never eat an apple without thinking about you and wish you had some. And when I sit down to eat and think about that you have nothing but meats and bread, and sometimes I can hardly stand it. So they certainly knew that they were missing these things. And so remember that letter when we get to the Sanitary Commission and talk about that. So how will the Army respond to food needs of comfort, nutrition, and affordability? And how will the soldiers adapt their rations to make this food palatable or even tasty? Did these new volunteer soldiers know anything at all about cooking for themselves after leaving home? So I want you to think about a standard 3-day ration for soldiers. If you were in charge of making a 3-day ration for soldiers, what would you put in it? And what things would you need to consider about that? Again, I'm most working with students, so I'm not going to expect you to answer these questions, but I have to pose them. It is my nature. So they don't have, like Army K rations and things like soldiers in World War II and later would have. But they have to think about what? They have to think, they don't want it to be heavy to carry. That's good. I didn't even think about that. They got to think about, so you've got to think about giving these soldiers energy, keeping up their strength. They have to, William Davis writes of a 3-pronged issue, getting adequate amounts of food to the armies, wherever they are as they're moving on time, in the right place, and in a palatable condition. So you need food that is going to through the transport and the test of time. See, fresh bread is going to be difficult, right? Because it's going to go moldy, especially when you don't have preservatives and things like that. So you have to transport it to the field. The war is already expensive. You have to make it filling for the men. So did taste come into play at all with these things? Today's Army rations, they do testing and they have to figure out the taste. So this is an 1861 Union Army marching ration. Typically, they were issued a 3-day ration, a pound of hard bread, or as we're going to see, soft bread on occasion, which I'll get to. 3/4 pounds of salt pork. If you know Ranger John Nicholas, he's got a piece of mostly fatty, what it would be like. It would be like, not even like bacon, just a lot of fat and a little bit of meat. That they carried around in those haversacks, or 1 1/4 pound fresh beef. So the beef did travel with the armies, so that was occasionally true. 1.28 ounce of roasted coffee. We're gonna read about how important the coffee ration was to soldiers. So 1.28 ounces was probably not enough. I measured this all out for that Gettysburg College lecture that I referred to, and it does not look like a lot, if you're a coffee drinker, that is. 0.24 ounces of sugar and 0.6 ounces of salt. Again, canned foods were available at the sutler, but were heavy to carry. If they could afford them, the sardines and oysters were the most popular. And then they could obtain foraged rations from local sources to supplement their diet. And they were also occasionally issued, through the Commissary we'll get to that too, through the, by company, desiccated vegetables. And a cubic inch of desiccated or dried out vegetables, which were not popular with the men, would make a full quart of soup. Some of the foraging they could forage whole pigs or chickens, and they would wrap them in dirt and clay and cook them in the ground, and then the clay falls to pieces. And that's, if any of you watch, again, those of you who are foodies, have you watched The Chef's Table on Netflix? Okay, so there's an episode where they do that on some remote island. This world-renowned chef does this, and I'm like, well, Civil War soldiers were doing that, so that's kind of interesting. Okay, so campfire cooking around the campfire is how we usually think of soldiers. So when they're on campaign and they're with a mess, certain numbers of soldiers, there's some great stories. I think it was Father Corby who wrote about going to the sutler, and they each would put in a dime in their mess, a group of men, to get a frying pan, right? This would be a luxury. And then they would take turns. One person would carry it one day, and then they'd get to pick the first portion the next. And that quickly fell out of favor because it was just too heavy to carry. So a soldier's kitchen was the campfire. It was fueled by fence rails or whatever wood was around, together with, quote, a tin cup or old fruit can, knife, fork, and spoon, and tin plate or a canteen half used as a tin plate. A Maine soldier in the A Maine soldier in the 3rd Corps of the Army said, "A dirty, smoke and grease begrimed tin plate and tin dipper have to serve as our entire culinary department. We boil potatoes, fry pork, and make coffee all in our dippers." And I brought a dipper here with me today. Hardtack ration. Why was the hardtack the staple of the soldier's diet? Well, we alluded to it a little bit before, and you saw on that first slide. Easily transportable in the crates. It's going to last a really a long time. They were shipped to soldiers in lots of 250 in wooden boxes. They had many nicknames for them: sheet iron crackers, worm castles, teeth dullers, Lincoln pies, or McClellan pies. One soldier said, quote, "He believed he could now understand why, when he enlisted, the doctor examined his teeth so carefully. He thought what a good thing it would be to line one of his shirts with army crackers and put that on whenever there was going to be a fight." In Billings' book, he said it was no uncommon occurrence for a man to find the surface of his pot of coffee swimming with weevils after breaking up hardtack in it, but they were easily skimmed off and left no distinctive taste behind. So, some preparation methods for making this hardtack and as well as the meat ration, which we'll get to in a minute, palatable. They could eat it straight out of the box, dip it in their coffee, as that soldier talked about. They could crumble it in their soup to thicken it. They had a dish called skilly glee, which was you'd take the hardtack biscuit, you'd soak it in cold water, you'd fry it in grease, probably from your meat ration, and then salt that. Another thing was called hell-fired stew, which you would pulverize down that hardtack, soak it when it was pulverized, and fry it. Lobscourse, which was boiling salt pork, hardtack, and vegetables together. Couche was like hell-fired stew, but with bits of meat added in. Something called hardtack pudding. I'm going to try this someday. This is what they did. They took the hardtack, they kind of had to soften it, make it into a pie dough, cover it with stewed dried apples or whatever they had on hand, then rolled it up, wrapped it in cloth, and boiled it for an hour. So that's trying something. So they didn't necessarily know how to cook, but they were trying things. And then in Greg Coco's book, a soldier named Fisk, he created a hash, and I'm sure lots of soldiers had their own way of making things. But Fisk's hash was a hardtack crushed into flour, so really crushed down. The meat was cut into very small pieces. The broth saved from when the cook boiled the fresh meat was added to his spider, the pan that sits up, with extra water and meat and reduced down. The hardtack flour added with mashed up potato if that was available. So they were trying all sorts of different things. The meat ration. So the quartermaster drew the meat ration from the commissary, and they took turns with the different cuts of meat. So, sometimes your meat ration might be better than another. So, for example, if the last selection was a meaty hindquarter, then you might have to take a bony forequarter the next time. Here's some descriptions of the meat ration. Salt pork was the most common. It was packed in salty lard, shipped in barrels, boiled or roasted over a fire on the end of a stick or bayonet, or sometimes sandwiched between the hardtack. A Kentucky soldier, when talking about the meat ration, said, quote, "It was damp, musty, and almost green with mold when issued to us. My share gave me such a pain in my stomach, and I could hardly walk." Sergeant Crotty of Michigan said, "We are not very particular how we cook our pork. Sometimes we fry it in a tin spider, which we make by cutting into a canteen. Other times we punch our ramrods through a slice and let it fry over the campfire. And in order not to lose any of the grease, we hold a hardtack under it and let the gravy drop on it, which answers well for butter." If you're pretty hungry, that might not taste too bad. The coffee ration. Okay, so this is an illustration on the back of which says, "The rebel soldiers were entirely without food, and our men shared coffee and rations with them." So coffee was a common love with both armies. The average Union soldier, we think, consumed as much as 2 to 3 quarts of coffee per day. How many of you are there? They were issued, the coffee ration was already roasted, but it was unground. And so I have coffee in here, and do you know how they ground it? They took the socket end of their bayonet. I have kids try this. It takes a while. And that's how they would grind up their coffee beans. And again, with their boiler, they would make a very, very strong coffee. I was exploring that surgeon's handbook that I referenced earlier, and it even talked about the surgeons. This is a quote from Dr. Tripler in the surgeon's handbook. I consider it imprudent for the surgeon to visit his hospital in the morning until he has taken his coffee. So coffee was important luxury for them, but they also felt that it had, you notice he says taken his coffee, just like you would take a pill. It was considered not exactly medicinal, but definitely a part of keeping the Army hardy and on the go. How they gave out the rations of coffee, this is a popular illustration that is in the Billings book of how they properly apportioned it. So they would do this for a number of rations in the companies. They'd spread out the rubber blanket, and they would put the coffee and maybe even the sugar portion all in one, and then they would turn their, well, I'll read it to you. Spread a rubber blanket on the ground, and upon it were put as many piles of the coffee as there were men to receive rations, and the care taken to make the piles of the same size to the eye, to keep the men from growling. In some companies, to prevent any charge of unfairness or injustice, the sergeant would turn his back on the rations and take out the roll of company. Then someone else would point to a pile and ask, "Who shall have this?" And the sergeant, without turning, would call a name from his list of the company or detachment, and the person thus called would appropriate the pile specified. So, you can imagine if you're hungry, thirsty, you're hangry, as they call it. They're trying to be as fair as possible. But this cooking by the campfire with your mess was not the most common way, though, that soldiers got their food. So they got their food from the commissary, and would be given extra rations for every 100 rations, i.e. for the company. They were also issued from the commissary a peck of beans or peas, 10 pounds of rice or hominy. This is for 100 men, remember. 10 pounds of green coffee, 8 pounds of roasted coffee, 15 pounds of sugar, candles, soap, 2 quarts of salt, 4 quarts of vinegar, 4 ounces of pepper, a half bushel of potatoes, and a quart of molasses, or substitutes dried vegetables, dried fruits, pickles, or pickled cabbage. And then it was up to the company cook or company cooks to make do. So the company cooks might be somebody who had a little bit of experience cooking before or wanted to cook. It might be done on a rotating basis. That certainly happened early in the war. And so this is how they would more often than not get their food. This shows the photograph on the right is a close-up of a bake oven, so for fresh bread. So those traveled with the commissary. So while the commissaries weren't doing all the cooking, if there was time and they had these ovens, they would substitute the hardtack ration with fresh bread whenever they could, which made a welcome change to the soldiers. And then I find it really interesting, the bottom picture there on the left are some regimental cooks who have taken kettles that they were issued and they've made stoves out of them. So pretty ingenious. But the recommended way for cooking is pictured on the upper left, almost the recommended way of cooking. That was the common thing to do, is you have the S-hooks and you have your pots, kettles, and you have it over an open flame. But this shows you what they were supposed to do. They even sent around in manuals these diagrams, dig a pit and put those things on. And the soldiers in the upper left, they have that pit. But more often than not, you're not really digging that pit. You're doing as the company cook does here on the right. Again, in field armies, units detailed multiple enlisted men to act as cooks on an ad hoc basis. Sometimes there were 1 to 2 per company, and often 1 for every informal mess of a half a dozen soldiers, and the duty rotated. A New York soldier, regarding the cooks for each company, said, "Everyone smokes or chews tobacco here, so we find no fault because the cooks do both. Boxes or barrels are used for kitchen tables and are used for seats between meals. The meat and bread are also cut on them, and if a scrap is left on the table, the flies go right at it, and we have so many the less to crawl over us. So not exactly sanitary conditions. Again, remember in the Civil War, they don't know about germs, and they don't know about how diseases necessarily. We're going to get into the medical theories a little bit in a few minutes. But so they're doing all of it together. This illustration, look how happy that guy is to have his steaming cup of coffee. I have a feeling that was not very close to the reality of it, but here is a description from a soldier regarding breakfast call. He said, "We grab our plates and cups and we wait for no second invitation. We each get a piece of meat and a potato, a chunk of bread and a cup of coffee with a spoonful of brown sugar in it. Milk and butter we buy or go without. We settle down, generally in groups, and the meal is soon over. We save a piece of bread for the last, with which we wipe up everything, and then we eat the dish rag." I love that. Dinner and breakfast are alike, only sometimes the meat and potatoes are cut up and cooked together, which makes a really delicious stew. Supper is the same, minus the meat and potatoes. So what do they have for supper? Bread. Yeah, they have bread and probably and likely more coffee. So the food ration of the soldiers was only as good as the cooks, but there were others looking out for the health and comfort of the men on the lines. And so now I want to go to our third, hey, I'm doing okay on time. Yes, the third of 4 sections, which is just talk about the soldiers before they're wounded, and the Sanitary Commission and the Medical Corps, and a little bit of what they knew about food. So let's talk about the Medical Corps and the Sanitary Commission, and this could be a whole lecture, and maybe we'll do this next year. Their relationship was codependent. It was fraught at the beginning. The Medical Corps was slow to gear up with enough men. They had a lot of recommendations, but they didn't like the Sanitary Commission coming in and telling them what to do. But very, very soon they realized that the Sanitary Commission had great recommendations and had great aid and could assist in the health and diet of the men before they were wounded as well as after. And so this is an illustration on an envelope of the time period, and it shows kind of what we think of when we think of the Medical Corps and the Sanitary Commission working together. You see the wounded soldier being taken care of on the battlefield, and in the back rides up on horses. They're galloping up with a wagon of United States Sanitary Commission supplies. So studies on health and as related to nutrition for the troops in the field were coming out all the time. And one of these studies was done with the 12th and 15th New York. You're from New York. Anybody else from New York? Okay, I'm sorry about this, but this is true. These units were selected because they were considered, quote, the most deficient in the proper culinary knowledge of those in the camps around Washington. And so what they did was they kind of taught these men how to cook very quickly. And in 6 days, they had the men cooking for themselves and saw a reduction in diarrhea cases from 20 a day to 5 a day. So all soldiers had diarrhea. We know what causes diarrhea now. And you take Pepto-Bismol and you try to get yourself to stop going to the bathroom, right? Kids, by the way, think this discussion is hilarious. But the medical theories of the time, this is where they start to look at, they don't understand that where this diarrhea came from. So they were operating off of very old theories, just updated a little bit. So the old theories that you may have heard of are like that, way back in Hippocrates' time, that your body consists of 4 different fluids: black bile, yellow bile, and to have health, you've got to keep those fluids in balance. And if one of them, if you have too much of one or not enough of another, and there's an imbalance, then you're not at ease. You have dis-ease or disease. And so while things like bleeding soldiers was largely out of favor at the time of the Civil War, the theory was still there that you would bleed or cup a wound because they had too much blood or whatever. So we're going to talk a little bit about how that had progressed by this time, but a lot of their ideas about food and nutrition and health comes from this. So they did these different studies, and then in 1861, there was a manual that came out called Hints on the Preservation of Health in the Armies. A second edition was printed in 1863. This was by John Ordronaux. An entire chapter was called On the Food of Soldiers and Education of Cooks. And this is just rich. This publication is just rich with quotes that seem preposterous to us today, but reveal kind of what they felt they understood. So here are just a couple of quick ones. The diet of the soldier plays an important part in the economy of his military life, for in contradistinction to the civilian, it is not sufficient that his food should simply sustain life, but it should also be possessed of such qualities as to develop in him a high degree of animal spirits. What does that even mean? I'm not sure. He said, it should give vigor to his health through appropriate stimulating virtues and leave behind a measure of positive strength due to its inherent tonic properties. So tonic properties, so they're starting to connect, food and health. He said, in an economic point of view, it may be said that a weak soldier is no soldier, costing the state more to support him than his services are worth. It is far cheaper to feed him well in the field than to nurse him in the hospital. True, right? So it's the same with the military today. You want to keep healthy soldiers in the fight. So how did Dr. Ordronaux rate the rations? He said they were monotonous uniformity, almost to exclusivism, and that it had unseasonable character, that they had the same old foods over and over. He believed that their nutrition depended upon their assimilation. So in other words, they're only going to be good if the body assimilates. So it was all their stuff was about digestion and assimilation. And he said, assimilation upon that tone of the digestive canal, which manifests itself through taste and relish. And here's where I agree with Dr. Ordronaux wholeheartedly. He said, what we cease to relish, we are neither apt to assimilate nor to be nourished by. In other words, if it doesn't taste good, they're not going to eat it, and they're not going to be nourished by it. So I like that. I think he's kind of get it. He's talked about as now established, the soldier's fare as a winter diet, rich in elements well suited to meet the requirements of respiration under a low temperature. In summer, now I have no idea what this means, but bear with me. In summer, on the contrary, the excess of carbon furnished by it to the lungs beyond what they can dispose of imposes additional duties of elimination upon the liver and tends unduly to excite this organ. A predisposition to biliary disorders is consequently engendered. So they're talking, they had all these homeopathic theories, not the four humors necessary, but what's going to excite the body, what's going to calm down the body. This is what they did. So his solution was that fruits, vegetables, and spices, which he called nature's own correctives, that should be sent to the troops from their hometowns in barrels. And here's where the Sanitary Commission begins to come in. Oh, here's another quote from Ordronaux. Soldiers are not anacondas or ostriches whose digestive organs can dispose of anything that may be presented to their action. Hence, boggy bread and leathery beans have killed more troops than bullets, and they will continue to do so until some radical reform is introduced into the regimental kitchen. So he's really trying to get these cooks and these regiments and everybody to take more seriously how food's going to affect the armies. And so here's where the United States Sanitary Commission come in. Just to redeem those of you from New York, I'll redeem this by saying the Sanitary Commission began in the state of New York with the Women's Central Association of Relief. That would eventually become the United States Sanitary Commission in June of 1861. It was following the model of the British Sanitary Commission from the Crimean War. And it would spend the rest of the war trying to work in cooperation with the government in ministering to the physical health and comfort of the men. And much of their efforts focused on food. So let's look briefly at the Sanitary Commission. This was that rabbit hole I went down, but it is absolutely fascinating. The Sanitary Commission here in Gettysburg. So one of the first things they did, even while the battle was going on, was they distributed the stores, or all the foods and supplies, blankets and things that they had been collecting. They were based in Frederick, sometimes in Westminster, and they said as soon, J.H. Douglas, who was the Associate Secretary of the Commission, said as soon as the wounded began to come in, I started out with the wagons to distribute the stores. We reached 5 different hospitals, which were all we were able to find that night, and early in the morning 3 others, which exhausted our stores. And so they brought a certain number of supplies, and then they purchased used the Fonstock store. That's what it looked like on the right at the time. You can see all of the things outside and inside, and this is what the building looks like today on the left. Building still stands, but it's obviously been changed quite a lot. That was their supply depot. And so they would put all of blankets, which they needed more of, and food stores, and barrels and barrels and boxes and everything that was sent from home. And they would have it there. And each morning, the supply wagons of the division and corps hospitals were before the door, and each day they went away laden with such articles as were desired to meet their wants. So this was in that 3 weeks at Gettysburg. Georgiana Woolsey, you'll notice if you ever are able to read that account, which is so interesting, that she is always, just like all the Sanitary Commission, they're always threading through a thank you to the home front. Thank you for sending it in, and thank you for doing this. And that brings me to not just the stores and the supply stores, but also something called relief lodges. They set up a relief lodge initially out near what's going to become Camp Letterman, so 30 East. Before you go in to Giant, there was a relief lodge because the railroad was out there at that time too, on the left. And then eventually there was a huge relief lodge right in that empty lot next to the train station, across from the Lincoln Diner, right? So there's an empty lot there now. I think actually they're going to be building something there sooner. But that was a relief lodge where they would take care and feed. They had 2 trains that left a day, and the wounded, if the trains were filled, then they would have to feed and take care of the soldiers for that night until the next train left in the morning. So as the hospitals are being consolidated all around, they're coming into the train station, and the Sanitary Commission picked up that effort to take care of them until they were on the train, and even when they got on the train. So Georgiana Woolsey has great descriptions of this. She said, we set up 2 stoves with 4 large boilers, always kept full of soup and coffee, watched by 4 or 5 black men who did the cooking. Then we had 3 large hospital tents holding about 35 each, a large camp meeting supply tent where barrels of goods were stored, and our own smaller tent filled up with tables where jelly pots and bottles of all kinds of good syrups, blackberry and black currant, stood in rows. And there are other descriptions of the food that they had stocked there, and it's so interesting. And a lot of these foods, like jellies and jams, wouldn't that take you back to home if you're waiting to get on a train to go to a large city hospital, or maybe they're sending you home to recuperate there. And even once they got on the trains, this is not a train here in Gettysburg, it's just a photograph of a train that I found, but even when they got on the trains, the United States Sanitary Commission was taking care before the trains leave. So with the wounded. So our detail of men would go from car to car with soup made of beef stock or fresh meat, full of potatoes, turnips, cabbage, and rice, with fresh bread and coffee, and when stimulants were needed, with ale, milk punch, or brandy. Another source that, by the way, I used, because I'm fascinated by milk punch. We have in our research library right down here the Medical and Surgical History of the Civil War. And it's multi-volume set. And it's got all these cases and all this interesting stuff. And this is just the index for A through K. And if you look up in the index, food and diet, you can go to milk punch, and you have every case where they, I have the page number and the volume for every case where they provided what was called milk punch to the soldiers. And so I was like, okay, well, what's milk punch? And I searched and searched and searched, and I have a recipe for it up here if you would like to see it later. And I'm going to tell you where I got it in just a few minutes. But they're using these different ways to either stimulate or excite the body or calm down the body based on their wound or based on their illness. Okay. So we're going to transition now to our final topic, which is the prescriptive food in the hospitals. So the headquarters of the United States Sanitary Commission, this is an illustration of that, was out at Camp Letterman. And Camp Letterman was created for those whose serious wounds prevented them from being removed. And they had 2 sanitary commission tents there, one for the stores or the supplies and the food, and one for the ladies who would be in charge. So these are the Georgiana Woolsey. We're going to talk about other women there, but I just want to talk about in general. I added this slide yesterday because when I was searching for milk punch, I came across 3 women of note throughout the course of the Civil War as related to food. You know the one, probably everybody knows the one on the left, or you've heard of her, Florence Nightingale, and her book, Directions for Cooking by Troops. She had been, again, everybody heavily influenced by the Crimean War and everything there, and that was distributed to both armies in 1862. And the woman there in the middle is a woman named Ann Wittenmeyer. And here is Ann Wittenmeyer's book, and this is where I found my milk punch recipe. You can find it online. I printed it out. It was called A Collection of Recipes for the Use of Special Diet Kitchens in Military Hospitals. And that was published in 1864 by the United States Christian Commission. And let me see if I can find milk punch here quickly, and I'll tell you what it is. Does anybody know what it is? I'm going to see if you, to me it sounds like what you would do for a hangover, but here it is. Here's the recipe for milk punch. Ready? Beat an egg until very light. Stir into a pint of milk. Add brandy, sugar, and nutmeg. There is a recipe for eggnog, which is slightly different. But yeah, something like eggnog, so that is milk punch. So that is in Ann Wittenmeyer's book. And Mary Bickerdike, or you've heard of Mother Bickerdike, as she was known, traveled with Sherman and famously fed the troops along the way, so much so that they referred to her as Mother Bickerdike. So let's quickly talk about field hospitals and then, again, a little bit of experience at Camp Letterman. In the U.S. Army Medical Department's Hospital Steward's Manual, there is a section on food and its preservation. And part of this has to do with why they selected farms for field hospitals. It has to do with you have the shelter of the barns and everything, but it also has to do with you have a water supply through a well, and you have the houses of the farms that you can use to prepare food. So again, diseases, theories had to do with diseases or wounds that had too much or too little stimulation of the body. So bleeding, purging, sweating, and a bland diet treated too much stimulation. Alcohol, certain drugs or tonics, and a rich diet treated too little stimulation. And so those were kind of the two things. And so in the field hospitals, they're just trying to give comfort as best they can. But once they get to Camp Letterman, now they're going to operate on a system of full diet, half diet, and low diet. And full diet, half diet, and low diet, I will just go over very briefly. They had plenty of receipts or recipes, as we call them. And to these classes of diet must be added what they called the articles of extra diet. And one of the articles of extra diet is liquor. Okay, so, when they're in, this is Cornelia Hancock, and so it's, they had moved a lot of the wagons with the medical corps supplies off down in Westminster so that the troops can get up to the field, and it took a while for those things to get to her. And so I use this slide on almost every program I do because I think it's so interesting. So there was not a spoon, knife, fork, or plate to be had that day, and it seemed as if there were no more serious problem under heaven than the task of dividing that too well-baked loaf into portions that could be swallowed by weak and dying men. I succeeded, however, spreading jelly over each with a stick. I'm just picturing her cleaning off a stick and trying to give just a little morsel of food to these men. Eventually, all the hospitals are consolidated again east of town into Camp Letterman, and this is a photograph of Camp Letterman. The economics of food come into play at Camp Letterman. They have the Commissary that's providing some, they have medical purveyors that provide others, and then they have something called the Hospital Fund. I'm going to skip over that and just get a little bit more into this is the cookhouse there. Justice Silliman is a soldier from the 17th Connecticut who assisted while he was being treated there in cooking. He said it's carried on a grand scale. The cooks at every meal set a table for about 700 nurses and workmen and furnish all the wounded with half a dozen different kinds of food. So this is basically, and I don't, yeah, you should be able to read that. A full diet was well-made coffee at breakfast of reasonable strength, some relish, which would vary daily. And relish was, when they talk about relish, they're talking about either cold meat, bacon, or a meat stew with onions or potatoes, or salted or fresh fish. That's what they considered relish. Dinner was at noon with soup or meat and vegetables and bread. It is believed by the author of this work that a pint of some mild malt liquor might advantageously and without too great expense be added to the dinner of a general hospital in most localities. I love that. And then supper was at 6, which was the lighter meal made of tea, milk and sugar, bread and butter, and occasionally they would add some dried fruit. A half diet was then intended for those patients whose condition as such required a smaller amount of nutriment than afforded by the full diet, and so it was just literally like a half a diet. And every hospital, every doctor had a different kind of prescription as to what they would specifically like for each patient. So imagine these people trying to cook for this. The soldiers who are some wounded themselves, the women who are coming in, the Sanitary Commission, they're trying to accommodate all of these various diets. And then a low diet was just very light. This was again considered like bland, nothing that would overstimulate the wound or the sickness, very bland liquid diet. And then they would just have very, very little bit of food. But it was not without its fun. So in the Adams Sentinel of September 29th, 1863, they describe the banquet that was had at Camp Letterman. Now, my mom, I mentioned, is 92, and she's not well, but you mention ice cream, and she is ready to go, right? So I think that, again, this gets to our universality of food. They described it as a perfect success. Long tables were spread for those who were able to leave the tents covered with everything that the most fastidious taste could desire. 400 or 500 chickens, 20 or 30 hams, 50 tongues, oysters in abundance, pies, cakes, peaches, grapes, watermelons, and cantaloupes loaded the tables. About dark, ice cream was introduced, and so prompt was the attention of the ladies in the different wards that in a very short time, all in and out of the tents had an abundant share of this luxury. So they're using food not just to improve their health, but also to kind of sort of feed their souls and keep them up. So what? What value do we gain by looking closely at the food of the Civil War era at home, in camp and on campaign, and recovering in Civil War hospitals? I would submit again that the value comes in the universality of the food experience. We all eat, right? That food can transport us to any other place in the world and any other time period within those cultures. It is sensory, and we perceive our world through our 5 senses. You can read about the Civil War, but to walk around the peach orchard on any July 2nd is to see and to feel the ground. You can try to imagine the sound of a cannonade, but to hear an artillery demonstration and smell the gunpowder, perhaps you begin to understand its terror. Taste is often the missing sensory experience in our study in the past, and yet when added, we perhaps are the closest to time travelers as we will ever be. So if the American Civil War is the defining event in the history of this country, the long 4 years that solidified who we all are as Americans, then understanding the food of the era, the daily sustenance of a people who fought and were maimed or died for their cause, is one small visceral way to connect with them. So I hope you all feel even a little bit more connected to this common past today. And I thank you for your attention. Thank you.